The camera opens on a grainy, slow-motion shot of Highbury. It's not the Highbury of modern luxury flats, but the Highbury of 1971. Smoke in the air, a sea of flat caps, and the smell of rain on concrete. We see a young man with long, dark hair, his socks rolled down to his ankles, leaning back as he strikes a ball with terrifying purity. This isn't just a highlight reel. This is an autopsy of a career that some call a tragedy and others call a triumph of the human spirit. How Charlie George wasted his career, a story told by those who never understood what made him special in the first place. When people talk about George, they use words like unfulfilled, problematic, or undisciplined. They point to the single England cap and the relatively short list of major trophies. But what if Charlie George was never meant to follow the rules? What if his rebellion wasn't a flaw in the machine, but the very spark that powered the engine? What if we've been looking at his career through the wrong lens for 50 years? To understand Charlie, you have to understand where he came from. He wasn't just an Arsenal player, he was Arsenal. He grew up in Islington, a stone's throw from the stadium. He was a boy who stood on the North Bank dreaming of being the king of the pitch, and then, by some miracle of fate and talent, he actually became it. He made his debut on the 9th of August, 1969, against Everton. He was just 17 years old. 2 games later, he smashed in his first goal against West Bromwich Albion. The crowd didn't just cheer, they felt a jolt of electricity. This wasn't another academy product being integrated into a system. This was one of their own, playing with the swagger of a man who owned the streets. George had what coaches call natural ability, that unteachable grace on the ball. But he also had something else, something that would define his entire life. He had a refusal to be managed. In his very first season, he spent 3 months in the reserves. The reason? Ill discipline. While other players kept their heads down and followed instructions, George questioned them. While others stayed quiet to protect their spots, George spoke up. Some called it a bad attitude. Others saw it as character. In reality, it was both. The tragedy of Charlie George's early career was a clash of philosophies. Arsenal manager Bertie Mee came from a military background. He ran the club like an army unit. Everyone had their place. Everyone followed orders. Mee would brook no argument from players about anything. His way was the only way, and if you didn't like it, there was the door. For most players, this structure provided a safety net. For Charlie George, it was psychological torture. Imagine being an artist, forced to paint by numbers. George helped Arsenal win the European Fairs Cup in 1970, and his performance was so sublime that even the legendary Johan Cruyff praised him. But Bertie Mee couldn't see past the hair, the attitude, and the defiance. George brought swagger to a disciplined team. He injected creativity into rigid tactics. The fans loved him for it, because he was the antidote to the grey, mechanical nature of 1970s English football. The manager, however, saw a virus. The clashes between the two became the stuff of legend. George would later call me pompous in his autobiography, noting that the manager simply couldn't handle individualism when it came with an edge. By the 1974-75 season, the two men barely spoke. George reached a point of no return, publicly stating that both he and the club would be better off if he was sold. It was a heartbreaking stalemate. His teammate Bob Wilson, a man of immense wisdom, believed that a less rigid manager, someone like a Brian Clough or a modern-day player manager, might have let George flourish by simply letting him be himself. Don Howe, the coach, later admitted how hard it was to manage someone who became a superstar before he was emotionally ready for the constraints of the professional game. But it wasn't just about arguments in the locker room. George's rebellion played out on the pitch in front of millions. In the 1971-72 season, he headbutted Kevin Keegan. He famously flicked a V-sign at Derby County fans after scoring a goal. In 1973, after being hacked down by Newcastle's David Craig, George retaliated with a fury that the media pounced on. Joe Harvey, the Newcastle manager, was a master of media manipulation. He painted George as the villain, the symbol of a permissive society, where the youth had lost their way. Headlines screamed about Arsenal's lack of discipline. It was theatre. Of course the players shook hands and had a drink after the match, but the damage to Charlie's reputation was permanent. He was now officially a luxury player with a short fuse. By July 1975, the bridge was burned. Arsenal sold their local hero to Derby County for £100,000. George thought a fresh start away from the shadow of Bertie Mee would save him. For a while, it looked like he was right. At Derby, he found his magic again. He scored 24 goals in a single season, and for a moment, Derby looked like they were going to do the impossible and win the double. They were the best team in the country, and Charlie was the conductor of the orchestra. Then, the universe intervened in the cruelest way possible. In March 1976, against Stoke City, George dislocated his shoulder and fractured his elbow. It wasn't just a physical injury. It was the moment the music stopped. Without him, Derby collapsed, winning only 6 points from their final 14 matches. They finished fourth. George would later say they would have won the double if he'd stayed fit, and nobody in football at the time disagreed with him. This began a heartbreaking cycle. George's body, as gifted as it was, began to betray him. Each setback seemed to hit at the exact moment he was about to prove the doubters wrong. His England career is perhaps the most concise summary of his entire life. It lasted exactly one match. In September 1976, Don Revie picked him for a game against the Republic of Ireland. George was substituted, had a screaming row with Revie on the touchline, and was never called up again. One cap, one argument, one wasted opportunity. When he moved to Southampton for £350,000, his knees were already gone. He admitted he felt a sense of relief just passing the medical. He spent half his time at the club in the treatment room. And then came the freak accident, the lawnmower. Charlie George, the man who could score from 30 yards, lost a finger in a gardening mishap. It was so surreal that fans turned it into a chant based on one man went to mow. His teammate Mick Channon joked that if Charlie had been a horse, they would have shot him. What the critics missed during those years was how the rebellion and the injuries were connected. The frustration of a failing body made him even more difficult to manage. The clashes with authority made his recovery periods more isolated. It was a downward spiral that no one in 1970s football had the tools to break. If Charlie George played today, things would be different. Today's managers aren't army generals, they are man managers. They work with sports psychologists, nutritionists, and recovery specialists. They understand that a difficult personality is often just the byproduct of a highly creative mind. We see players today with massive egos and eccentricities who are celebrated because the system adapts to them. George was a modern player born 40 years too early. He was a square peg in a world that only had round holes, and the harder they tried to hammer him in, the more he splintered. Yet, if you go to North London today, the word waste is never used. You won't find an Arsenal fan who looks back on Charlie George with anything other than misty-eyed reverence. They don't care about the single England cap. They don't care about the bad attitude reported in the tabloids of 1974. They remember the 1971 FA Cup final. They remember Charlie George lying flat on his back on the Wembley turf after scoring the winner against Liverpool, his arms outstretched in a pose of total, beautiful surrender. That moment, the long-haired rebel conquering the world is burned into the DNA of the club. The fans loved him because he was authentic. In an era where football was becoming a business, Charlie remained a local boy who refused to pretend. He didn't speak in cliches. He didn't bow to the establishment. He was Champagne Charlie, a man who lived his life on his own terms and paid the price for it without complaining. Today, you can still find Charlie at Arsenal, working in corporate hospitality. He stands in the lounges, wearing a suit, telling stories to grandfathers and their grandsons. There is no bitterness in his voice. In his autobiography, he is unflinchingly honest. He doesn't blame Bertie Mee, and he doesn't blame the injuries. He owns his choices. He knows that his refusal to conform is exactly why he's still loved. If he had been a good professional, he might have won 20 more caps, but he wouldn't be Charlie George. He wouldn't be the legend who coloured outside the lines. The real tragedy of Charlie George isn't that he wasted his talent. The tragedy was a football culture that couldn't handle beauty when it came in an unconventional package. George represented everything that made 1970s football glorious: the raw passion, the local pride, the unfiltered emotion. Modern players are coached from the age of 8 to say the right things and follow the pathway. They are polished, professional, and often somewhat hollow. Charlie George was never hollow. He was messy, he was loud, he was stubborn, and he was brilliant. His story is a reminder that talent doesn't always come wrapped in a neat bow of discipline. Sometimes it arrives complicated and difficult. The best leaders are those who can find the genius in the chaos. Bertie Mee and Don Revie failed that test, but the fans passed it. They saw the man for who he was. So, did he waste his career? If you measure a life by trophies and statistics, perhaps. But if you measure a career by the number of hearts you touched, the number of kids who grew out their hair to look like you, and the way a stadium still echoes with your name 50 years later, then Charlie George had one of the most successful careers in the history of the game. He didn't change himself to fit football. He forced football to remember him. He remained wonderfully, stubbornly himself until the very end. And in a world that is constantly trying to make us all the same, there is nothing more legendary than that. Charlie George didn't just play for Arsenal. He was the soul of the North Bank. He was the rebel with a cause, the artist with a broken brush, and the hero who reminded us why we fell in love with this beautiful, frustrating, chaotic game in the first place. He was never a wasted talent. He was a gift that the era wasn't quite ready to unwrap. Next time you see a player pull off something impossible, or a young kid get into trouble for speaking his mind, think of Charlie. Think of the boy from Islington who lay on the Wembley grass and became immortal. Because in the end, perfect discipline is forgotten, but authenticity lasts forever.